All right, so do you want fries with that? All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming out today on this beautiful day. I think it's celebrating Vancouver by simulating its weather here today. So it is definitely a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to the campus community, and my thanks also to the committee for inviting me. You in the audience might feel so there's been a little bit of a bait and switch. If you were paying attention around this time last year, you may have noticed that this was actually supposed to be Dan Deffenbaugh's talk, but he has moved on to other career prospects, and the committee was, I guess, forced to move further down the list. And I guess they had to move quite a way down the list, like, I don't know, maybe Roseanne Barr wasn't available or something like that. So they eventually came to me. And of course, you know, there's kind of a danger in inviting people to these things, because the instructions for this talk is, well, you've got 50 minutes, just talk about whatever you want to. You know, and that's a pretty broad topic, you know, whatever you're interested in. That's a pretty wide sort of a thing. And, you know, and it's also kind of a challenge, because you got to decide what it is that you want to talk about. So, I mean, my first impression was I just bring my list of names and sort of start giving people just general feedback. But that, you know, Travis Fiesel, no, but that didn't seem like such a great plan on the whole. So I figured, then I recalled at some point that, oh, wait a minute, I'm a historian, I should maybe talk about that. And since I'm trying to get back into some of the writing, the things that I have neglected for a while, I figured that this might be a way to do this. So afterwards, if you see me around campus, feel free to say, hey, how long have you been working on that book? You ever going to get finished? You know, I'm going to give me a kick in the backside, and maybe something will happen. So what I'd like to do today is to talk about an incident that was rather famous in its day in certain parts of the world. In fact, a murder, well, actually 2 murders, and the trial that followed afterwards. But by way of explanation, I should also say that this is an incident that I stumbled across while researching something else, and I bring it up now in part because I think aspects of it all speak to us somewhat today, and also because it's a way of getting back into the other topics that I'd like to work on. And I should say just at the beginning as well that since I started writing on this one, it's come to my attention that another scholar is dealt with this probably in a more effective and professional way than I have done, and so by looking at that, I have learned things. So what follows then is kind of a fusion of my work and someone else's that I think makes kind of an interesting meditation on the possibilities that you can find within just one small and apparently obscure event that seems to lead out in so many different directions. And I'm going to try to sketch out just a few of those things as well here for you today. Okay, wait a minute, I've lost my clicker. Okay. So we're talking about a murder, and the murder in question happened in Mexico City on the morning of July 10th in 1922 in a place called Colonia Roma, which, if you've been to Mexico City, is kind of one of the nicer neighborhoods in Mexico City, and at that time was the place that the really wealthy people went to live. And on that particular morning, a newly elected Mexican senator by the name of Francisco Tejeda Yorca was leaving his house in colonial Mexico, or in the Colonia Roma, in the company of several friends who were also deputies and senators, when he noticed an attractively dressed young woman, actually that young woman approaching in specifically that dress down the street, and apparently pointed her out to his driver. When she got close to him, she immediately leapt at him, grabbed him by the lapels, and screamed, "Kill me like you killed my father." And, well, he grabbed her by the arm and tried to force her to the ground, and she managed to pull out a .32 caliber pistol, which she fired several shots into him at close range before the companions that he was traveling with managed to grab her and disarm her. And between their blows, she managed to say, I have just killed my father's killer, and I beg that you surrender me to the police. All right. So Eventually, it ended up in a police station, and we're just pretending that's a police station. That's actually the courtroom, but, bear with me here, right? There aren't pictures of all of this stuff here, right? So we're improvising, all right? So on investigation, it turned out that the shooter was 14-year-old Ana Maria del Pilar Moreno Diaz, or when this one, we'll just generally call her Maria del Pilar Moreno. And she was the daughter, this fellow here, Jesus Moreno, who was both editor of a Mexican newspaper and an elected member of the Chamber of Deputies. So he was a member of the Congress. And he got into an altercation on the steps of the Secretario de Gobernación, which is effectively the Ministry of the Interior, with Tejeda Yorca a couple of months before. And in the course of the altercation, Tejeda Yorca had pulled out his gun and shot Jesus Moreno, and he died at the scene. So this was the background behind the particular incident. And Maria and her mother had gone to the government, and they'd spoken to members of different parties, they'd spoken to government officials, and they'd asked, can you do something about this? Can Tejeda Yorca be brought up for some kind of charges for what was clearly, by all intents and purposes, a homicide? And the answer they got was no. We can't do anything about that because he's an elected official, and elected officials have special protections that prevent them from being arrested or prosecuted. And Tejeda Yorca managed to walk away from what was fairly clearly a murder. And so now, after this shooting by Maria Moreno herself, Tejeda Yorca was dead, and Maria Moreno was sent to the correctional school in Coyoacán, where she lived, apparently, in that cell. Okay. So that's the kind of basics of the story, the kind of thing that the public would have seen, the reading public would have seen in the press and heard about. But we need to deal here with the underlying problem. And what's going on here, the motive in the murder, of course, and the reason that Tejeda Yorca is not himself in prison at this point, has everything to do with both the political situation and the kind of special protections that are given to elected representatives by the Constitution. And for this, before I get going on this, though, we need a bit of background so we understand what's going on here. So first of all, by show of hands, who recognizes this individual here? Okay, kind of what all right. How about these guys here? You're not going to be tested on you. Okay, yeah, a couple of people, yeah, all right. How about this person here? No? Okay. That, by the way, is Emilio Robles. That was known as the very first, would be commemorated as the first woman to ever gain a Mexican military pension, except that Emilio was the individual who solved the whole dead naming problem by just blowing away anybody that questioned his opinion about gender. So what I'm getting at, though, is that all of these people are revolutionaries. And Mexico had a long and violent revolution starting in 1910 that went on, depending on how you count, for another 7 or 10 or 15 or 25 years. It depends how you date this, but the point is that the 1920s is a time when there's still lots of violence and things are just kind of winding down from basically all-out war. And the second thing we need to know is that Mexico, the United States of Mexico, is governmentally a lot like the United States of America in that it is a republican system with a divided system of government with the 3 branches of government that consists, and most importantly for us, the legislative branch consists of the Chamber of Deputies, which is like the lower house, and then another house, the Senate. And you can probably guess what the members of these, so members of the lower house are called deputies. You can guess what the members of the Senate are probably called. All of these people have special protections given them by the Constitution that in the Mexican case is known as their fuero. And in principle, the idea of the fuero, which is very old, but the fuero for elected representatives goes back to independence when the first version of the Constitution said representatives couldn't be charged in regular courts, and they could only answer to their peers. And who are their peers if you're an elected representative? Well, that means to the other members of the Congress. So they could only be tried by other elected representatives. And the idea behind these, as you might imagine, was simply to protect people, to represent, make democratic representation of their views so they couldn't be harassed by being brought up on charges and thrown in jail or otherwise dissuaded from doing this. Now, by the 20th century, some of these protections had been reduced a little bit. Ultimately, they were still answerable now to the civilian courts. But when a deputy or a senator was accused of a crime, what would happen is it would go to, first of all, to the Chamber of Deputies, and they would have to meet, they would investigate the crime themselves like a court, and then they would vote on whether or not, by simple majority, whether or not they thought a crime had been committed and whether or not there was actual guilt involved. And if they found that there was guilt, the next thing they had to decide was whether or not the crime was criminal or political. And if they found the crime was simply a criminal act, they handed it off to the civilian courts. But if it was found to be a political act, and in the 20s, assassination could be seen as a political crime, it was passed on to the Senate. And the Senate had the power then to decide what happened with it. They acted as the court. They investigated, they found guilt, and they imposed sentence if they chose to. Now, all of these things then seemed like, when these ideas were framed, to be an important way of maintaining the independence and of the representative system. But of course, you can imagine in this that there's sort of an issue because the enforcement of these rules then falls to the values and the behavior and the attitudes of the people that are the members of Congress. And in a sense, they create themselves almost as a class apart, as people who have special powers and abilities that don't answer to the law that everybody else does. And in the 1920s, in the intense climate of factional dispute, here's a picture of the Constitution because we're talking about that. In the intense climate of factional competition, it was really hard. I doubt many people had much faith in this process was actually going to render an impartial decision. And part of the thing is the electoral system itself had been compromised by the violence of the revolution, the breakdown of institutions. For example, in the 1924 Congress, they spent the entirety of the legislative term just trying to figure out which candidates had actually won the election and had seats in the Congress. Of 164 electoral districts, 264 electoral districts, 250 had turned up with multiple candidates waving slips of paper that said they had won the election. Some of them had 5 different candidates, all claiming to have won the election. There were rival municipal governments installed. There were rival state governments, multiple state governors in Puebla and places, holding independent governments in different buildings around the town. In this climate, trying to use something like the desafuero process to eliminate your opponents was one crucial way of trying to get your faction to the top of everything. And surely there's some examples I've found of some people actually being held to account, but at the same time there's plenty of examples of them not being held to account. And a good example happens shortly after this trial, the next year, when a deputy by the name of Wenceslao Masip shot his friend, actual boyhood friend and former ally, representative from the same state, a man by the name of Moreno Perez. They got into an argument in the Congress in which Perez had questioned Masip's masculinity in specific terms, and they'd been inclined to fight it out right there in the middle of the Chamber of Deputies. Their colleagues said, no, calm down, and everything seemed to be calmed down. And later on, when the debate broke up, Masip followed Perez through the streets and just a couple of blocks from the Congress pushed him into the doorway of a darkened yard and shot him there. Now, he got arrested by the police and he got taken down to the police station, and actually on the way there, an angry crowd got him out of the police car and tried to lynch him from a lamppost. So you can tell that the crowd on the street had a different opinion about this. But when it finally came up in the Congress, the attitude was no. This wasn't a crime. He'd been insulted, and that insult was a matter of public record. And so his defense was, in fact, an act of defense of masculine honor. And in fact, they ended up reprimanding the police for having the audacity to arrest the man, right? And there are similar cases. There's another case of a man by the name of, a few years later, a deputy by the name of Radilla is arrested in a working class district in Mexico City. In his case, he was found by several policemen in a working class district in front of a bar, beating a woman, probably a prostitute, in front of a bar. When the police intervened, he pulled out his gun and shot both of them. They didn't die, but they were seriously injured. And the Congress stepped in and protested the fact that he should not have been arrested at all because his fuero gave him legal protections. All right. So this is the issue. And this is the extent of the problem. And this, in a sense, is the motive for the crime. So Tejeda Llorca is safe from prosecution because he's a member of the majority faction in the Congress. He could shoot an opponent in broad daylight on the steps of a government building in the middle of Mexico City and walk away. Okay. So we come then to the issue of the trial. April 1924 rolls around. It's almost 2 years after the shooting, and I should point out we're coming up on I guess, the 95th anniversary of this particular event coming up soon. And she's on trial for murder. There she is in the courtroom, surrounded by police. She'd admitted to the killing. The motive seems pretty clear, yeah? Why you might want to take revenge on this guy. And it certainly looked like a planned act of revenge. It didn't look like the kind of incidental thing that might happen here. So, okay, this comes to the jury. And people then are required to make a decision. So I'm going to ask you to act like the jury for a second here. So, all right, we'll do this like Roman emperor style. This is like what they, Cahoot from 2,000 years ago. All right, so like by thumbs up or thumbs down here, would you convict or acquit? Everybody your hand up here. So ready? Ready? Come on, hands up, hands up, hands up. I want a verdict from you. So thumbs up for convict, thumbs up for acquit. Ready? On your mark, get set, go. People are saying, okay, some are going to acquit, some are going to convict. Okay, all right, that's interesting response. Okay, all right. Why do the people that chose to? Some people chose to acquit. Why? I was going to speak. What's that?
She's 14.
She's 14. All right. And some people chose to convict. Why was that? She did it? Yeah. Okay. All right. She did it. Yeah. All right. So here's the thing. You can't really see it in this picture, but Mexico in 1924 had jury trials. And if that seems like a strange thing, it's a country that's run for the most part under the Napoleonic or the Civil Code, which means that in general have magistrates that are a step removed from the court system that's familiar in the United States, where the magistrate's duty is to assemble both evidence of guilt or probable cause and such, and also to assemble reasonable doubt. Right? Now, at this time, though, for a period of a few decades, Mexico was experiencing with grand jury trials, and these courtrooms were open, they happened on a regular basis, and apparently, as in this case, they were popular things to go. The Maria Moreno trial was so popular that they actually sold tickets, which sold out immediately. So this crowd that you can see on the screen have packed in to come see this. All right? Have packed in to come see this. And, we know what's the celebrity of this case? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, the scandalous and often violent behavior of elected officials is something that's dragging down the repute of the Congress. Lots of people apparently are unhappy with their representatives and with the congressional system generally. And it certainly seems that there's a kind of eye for eye sort of justice implied in this. Tejeda Llorca got away with it, and so she'd done it too. And also there's a sense of her, I think part of the celebrity as well, the amazing thing about it was that she'd done something that looked rather like what the deputies did of the defense of masculine honor. She had appropriated something that was ostensibly the prerogative of men. And so there was a kind of inversion of the established order. In that sense, they gave it a kind of celebrity. And various other stories started to emerge at the trial that kind of suggested perhaps that she might be innocent. And one of the stories was that they discovered, or claimed to discover partway through it, that the bullet that actually killed Tejeda, even though he had her 4 bullets in him, was actually a gullet gun from a different caliber. That emerged, and then there was accounts of a strong man who was seen at the scene firing a gun and then running away, and things like that emerged that sort of suggested a kind of guilt, a kind of innocence, or different strategies of establishing her innocence. So at the end of the day, the jury got their vote, and she was acquitted. She was found not guilty, and she walked out of the courtroom to rather massive public acclaim. So here she is receiving flowers, and she continued to receive flowers actually from the time of her arrest, and stepped out into the street. Can you spot her in there? If you look really close, you can see that sort of veil that she's wearing right in the middle. I guess I don't have a pointer on this thing. Or maybe I do. Somewhere. I hit the top one. There she is. Ah! But then it does that. Okay, so let's not... Okay, so let's not do that. Oh no, we're back to the beginning again. I guess I got to start over. Crap. Okay. All right. Time's going to be an issue here. All right. Okay, yeah, so there she is kind of in the middle. Here's another one you can kind of see right in the center, this massive crowd of people out to celebrate her victory. Her defense lawyers were lifted up and carried around the courtroom on people's shoulders, and she walked out of the courtroom absolutely free. And subsequently, she's also been recognized in some cases as a kind of a heroine, of a person who sort of seized that supposedly male prerogative of the use of violence. Okay. But here's the thing. We can look at this from different perspectives as well, too. The story I've given you here is what newspaper accounts had at the time, and it's mostly what I had the last time that I dealt with this. But another researcher, like I mentioned, Pablo Picato, has also written about this case, and his research reveals a little bit more than mine, so if we can kind of stir these things together. So this is part of the story, but if you think about it a little bit, it's actually more complicated than that. What's the next image? Okay, I'm going to back up here. Okay, so number one, let's think about her father. Yeah, her father is also a member of a deputy, right? Now, while he dies in this and kind of comes out as the innocent victim in the story, let's remember that they're both headed to see a high-powered government official to help them resolve a factional dispute by picking one side or the other. They're both armed. And the only reason that Jesus Moreno isn't the one doing the shooting is that Tejeda Yorca's friends grabbed his arms and prevented him from drawing his own pistol in part of the scuffle, right? So he's part of the same world. He's part of the same group that plays by the same rules in the Chamber of Deputies. All right, here's some other things. This is their house. This is the house that they built just a couple of years before their death. This is in the south of Mexico City. This area is now swallowed up by San Angel, which is now sort of not an urban area. And this time, it's actually fairly open land. She'd apparently liked it. Do you notice anything about her house? Sorry? It's gated. Yep, okay, yeah, it's a gated. And you can't really see it in this photo, but you see that window peeking out in the upper right-hand, kind of upper right there? That's actually the continuation of the house. It's actually got a very large compound with multiple buildings or sort of attached structures that are apparently part of it. It's fairly large. And you notice anything else if you look up on the front of this house? It's named for her. Yeah, okay. So this is a fairly well-established building that she lives in here. So she lives down in the southern part of Mexico City. And so the guy that she shot lives just to the west of the center in Colonia Roma. They're not right next door. So to get there, she said she was on her way to church when the shooting happened and that she just stumbled into Tejeda Yorca by accident. Well, the thing is, she had to get into one of her two cars and ask her driver to take her to Colonia Roma so she could go to her favorite church. And then she said, was just walking down the street when she stumbled into this man by accident, and then was so upset about realizing that this was the guy that had killed her father that they got into the altercation, which made it sort of a crime of passion. And of course, you should think by this point, there's another question that should be bothering you now if you're thinking sort of CSI, solve the mystery problem. And you may have guessed, why does she have a gun on her way to church, right? And especially remember the dress she's carrying. Why, if she's on her way to church, why is she armed? Now, the Mexican Constitution did at this time sort of recognize a right for people to have arms to defend themselves, but I believe by this point it had been amended to say in their houses, not tucked under this, not sort of hidden in a handbag or something like that. So she lived there, and so that's kind of an interesting question. She told the story, though. She said, this gun was actually given to me by my father. Our house has been threatened in the past because of his political activities. There's been some strange men have followed me, and so we have this story at the trial of her father sort of handing her this gun, which becomes not only a piece of defense, but in fact, the gun is really about my dead father. And so if you bring this up, then this is in fact, right, an appeal to, how I have been wronged. And there's some other details here that I also find slightly odd. She arrived at church, apparently her aunt was somewhere in the background of all of this, I'm not sure where. But soon after the shooting happened, her mother arrived in another car and took her away. She wasn't arrested at the scene. She was taken by her mother, who took her to the offices of her father's old newspaper. And she only surrendered herself to the police later that evening, presumably along with her lawyers. And at first, the story actually kind of changed. At first, she actually just said, yeah, he killed my dad, so I killed him. It was revenge. And then the story kind of changed, and it became this other thing about, no, it was more and more spontaneous. It was about the fact that he was hurting my arm, or I was afraid that he was going to shoot me. So it became this kind of defense. And while she was in prison, she wrote a book which describes her early life, their flight to the United States during the dictatorship in 1913, when she would have been about 6 years old. And she apparently wrote this while in prison. Well, yeah, it was written for the most part, I believe, with the assistance of journalists and probably also with the assistance of her legal team. And these pictures that I've seen, isn't it kind of odd that there are these photographs of people posed in courtroom settings? These are posed by her defense team. Some of them from the moment that she's incarcerated after the crime, some of them actually recreating the court or in the court itself. So there's a very careful management of her image from the time that she's administered. And she has a team of no less than 3 famous defense lawyers on her side who are arguing on her defense. She's managed to write, done all this stuff. And in fact, she did spend a fair bit of time in the correctional school. It turns out that the reality was that she was free to go after a short period of time. They said, well, there's not really any reason that we can't let you go. She could have returned home. She chose to stay there, only letting herself out periodically to place flowers on her father's grave, until her family figured out that the magistrates in charge of the trial were like, oh my God, I don't know how to resolve this, and they were trying to delay the decision that they eventually had to make. And at that point, her family kind of said, well, this is stupid, and she just moved out and lived with her mother. Of course, her father had died intestate, and they'd lost that nice home. So she had to live in a low-rent apartment in a different part of Mexico City, and part of her defense featured the observation that, well, her father had specifically instructed her mother to make sure that she was always nicely and respectably dressed and never had to harden her hands by doing housework so that she could focus on her intended career as a journalist. The defense liked to point out that now she had to perform chores. Something, right? Okay. So we have a series of portraits made at the same time, around the same time. The dates on these things are all for the archive. I'll date them as all as 22. Most of them can't be, they're wrong. I've just reproduced them here because I don't know exactly when they were taken. But okay, so does this change our opinions of things? Well, does this change our opinion of things? Well, what's going on here? I'll leave aside the question of whether killing for revenge is a legitimate thing or not. But clearly the jury believed that something warranted her exoneration, even though she'd more or less freely admitted to committing a murder and thereby directly violating the laws. Well, what I think what obviously happened here was something that you might call a kind of parallel immunity. There wasn't any way that they were going to be able to resolve the issue in the Congress. There was no way to get rid of the special protections accorded to the deputies and their particular impunity before the law. And so it might have seemed in that kind of retributive form of justice that if Tejeda Yorca couldn't be punished, then Maria Moreno somehow deserved a kind of parallel impunity and a pass on the violation of the laws. And so the question then becomes, on what grounds would they have given it? Well, partly because of the nature of the story itself and about revenge. But I want to suggest here as well that there's more than one kind of more than one basis that can be invoked here, forms of privilege and impunity. And in this case, clearly there's an issue of class status taking place here. Clearly there is an issue about respectability and the idea that the girl, decent girl from a respectable family had been wronged, and that therefore justice fell in her direction in avenging that. There was, of course, still the strange quirk that this had not been avenged by her father, but by herself, and that gave the case a certain amount of celebrity. Okay, but in a sense it suggested a kind of a situation in which one form of privilege reinforces another, in which one form of impunity works to generate others as well. Right? Ultimately, the fuero was controlled. I feel cautious when I talk about this kind of situation because it may give you the impression that Mexico is sort of land of chaos, and that is not at all the impression that I want to give here. The 1920s were more or less exceptional, and the violence of the deputies and the use of the fuero was more or less controlled. What brought it eventually under control by the 1930s and 40s was the decision by the ruling and dominant parties to simply enforce the rules of the Congress and to declare that when people committed things that looked like crimes, that they be relaxed to civilian justice. So, for example, when Delfin Najera walked out on his tab in a Mexico City restaurant and then shot the waiter that followed after him, they said, no, that's not a political act, that's a crime, and you can go off to jail for it. So it basically in the end fell to the parties to decide about things like, no, maybe deputies should not carry guns. Earlier there was a story told in the 1920s, probably apocryphal, but you can see it repeated, of a senator who apparently was observed to not be carrying a gun underneath his clothing, and his colleagues asked him at one point, why don't you carry a gun? And so the story went, he would just pat his briefcase and say, well, because I carry the Constitution with me everywhere I go, and that is all the protection that I need. Well, sometime down the road, he was involved in a violent altercation, and he opened up the briefcase, and La Constitución turned out to be a very large revolver with, La Constitución engraved on the barrel. I mean, this was the kind of stories that people told about deputies at the time. There was a deputy who walked into a Catholic church and said, when the Catholic churches were supposed to be closed, and said, hey, you can't have this church open, we need to close this church, and brandished a gun in the face of the priest, and the priest looked at it and sort of, Crocodile Dundee-esque said, well, that's not a gun, and pulled out another thing from underneath his cassock, and that's a gun. I mean, this kind of story. There were very real cases in which deputies in the Chamber of Congress either got in fights or gave each other the big Mexican abrazo and slap on the back, and the guy's gun went off and everybody drew and dropped under the floor. So this was kind of a chaotic period. But ultimately, the institution itself didn't just magically regulate anything. It fell to the parties and the groups in power to decide about the values. And I suppose in a way that it also fell to the electorate to inform their elected representatives about how they felt about these things and to try to reclaim some of the lost prestige. All right, in which case, I leave you with Maria Moreno free to walk away after her violent acts. Thank you. All right. Questions about anything? I can.
so you clearly talk about gender and social class.
Yes.
But a little less about her age.
Yes.
Was it typical for young people to shoot guns?
No, not typically. I think there's a bunch of things that are going on here. And one of them is her familiarity with firearms and things like that too, right? So there's kind of stories to explain how this has happened. Yeah, no, the celebrity of it is that she's young. And I think it's kind of interesting about her age. She's 14 when she commits the murder. She's, I don't think, actually fully 16. This is less than 2 years later. So she's about 15, which of course is kind of an important moment, right? This is, so it becomes almost like this sort of coming out party, right? There's a thing about her at that particular age of this is a sort of a young woman of society, and I think this might have to do something with her reception as well too. But yes, the age would certainly be part of this as well. It seems like she is in a way taking on a role that would traditionally sort of avenging family honor and such that would not normally would fall to her, right? But so the question then is, well, under exceptional circumstances, and her defense actually says, should children avenge their parents? And oh yes, absolutely. And apparently the popular audience and the reading press says, absolutely, we should do that. But yeah, that's an important aspect of this. Yeah, youth is something that is just beginning to be analyzed. There's some interesting ones about sort of the construction of youth in the 20th century and the time period for Mexico. Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, Zane.
You mentioned that early in the revolution that she and her family fled to the U.S.
Yeah.
Whereabouts were they residing?
All over the place. I think they were in San Antonio. They were in Texas at first, and then they may have gone to other locations as well, too. Yeah, Eagle Pass, which was El Paso, things like that. So they were in different spots.
Just across the border.
Yeah, so in somewhat, yeah. They kind of moved around a bit. I don't know how long. They probably didn't stay there for very long. So, all right. Yes?
Okay, so what happened to her after that?
Well, this is an interesting question. And this is one of those ones that somebody does something like this, I say obscure events. People kind of focus on this, and it's like after 1924, all right, well, we're done with analyzing you. You can kind of walk on. She lived until 1988, so she lived to be 81. And as far as I can tell, I can't find any other information about her. She just kind of vanished. I don't know what became of her. She was a celebrity at age 14, 15, 16, and then kind of just sort of faded off into the shadows. It would be an interesting question to find out. They know about her death dates, but don't know any more about her. So that's the kind of thing, some of this archival material for some of this stuff is kind of spotty. So I have a number of people I'm looking at that are just sort of ghosts. I know they show up and do something, and then, okay, we're gone, right? So, all right. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, then thank you all very much for coming out on this beautiful day. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much.